Some movies aren't just movies, they're warnings, controversies, and sometimes the kind of cultural hand grenades that governments panic over. Science fiction, the genre built on imagination, has always had a dangerous side. What happens when a story about space travel or dystopian futures feels a little too close to reality? What if the special effects weren't the scariest part? The ideas were. Today we're diving into 15 sci-fi films that rattled censors, sparked bans, and left scars on the cinematic world in ways few saw coming. King Kong, 1933. Imagine stepping into a theater in 1933 and watching a giant ape climb the Empire State Building, swatting fighter planes out of the sky like pesky insects. For most audiences, King Kong was jaw-dropping spectacle. For others, it was pure nightmare fuel. This wasn't just a movie, it was the collision of groundbreaking special effects and primal terror. Viewers gasped, some fainted, and governments quickly decided, nope, too much. Nazi Germany banned it outright, claiming the monster imagery was unacceptable. Finland initially blocked it, only allowing a heavily edited version to pass. Even in America, later re-releases were trimmed, with censors cutting screams, falls, and brutal fight sequences. The justification was simple. During the Great Depression, audiences didn't need something this violent staring them in the face. But here's the twist. Those cuts made the film even more infamous. People whispered about the lost scenes, the moments too terrifying for the public eye. That underground buzz gave the movie a reputation that only grew bigger than Kong himself. The stop-motion wizardry of Willis O'Brien was decades ahead of its time, and the mix of horror, fantasy, and adventure created a cinematic cocktail that shook the establishment. Instead of being forgotten, every ban, edit, and protest only made the legend stronger. King Kong became the ultimate proof that movies could disturb, provoke, and challenge as much as they could entertain. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a giant ape. It was a warning shot from Hollywood, showing that cinema could be dangerous. And that was exactly what made it unforgettable. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Few films caused more panic in living rooms and government offices than Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. On the surface, it was futuristic sci-fi with a twist, youth gone wild in a dystopian Britain. But underneath, it was something more dangerous. A mirror. And people didn't like what they saw. In the United States, it barely scraped into theaters with an X rating, and that was after cuts. Across the world, countries like South Africa, Brazil, and Singapore banned it entirely. Even in Britain, Kubrick himself pulled the movie after accusations that it was influencing real-life violence. For decades, you couldn't legally watch it in the UK. What rattled people wasn't just the shocking behavior of its characters, but the ideas buried in the story. Could free will exist in a world controlled by the government? Could young people be programmed into obedience? Kubrick didn't hand audiences easy answers. He rubbed their faces in the ugliness of human nature. The result? Outrage, debate, and a movie that became the poster child for dangerous cinema. While critics argued whether it was art or corruption, fans tracked down bootlegs just to see what the fuss was about. Decades later, the bans have lifted, but the fear it created still lingers. A Clockwork Orange wasn't just censored, it became a global symbol of what happens when art dares to push too far. Akira, 1988. By the late 1980s, Japanese animation was beginning to creep into Western culture. But when Akira arrived, it wasn't just another cartoon, it was a seismic shock. With its neon-soaked vision of post-apocalyptic Tokyo, biker gangs, and unstoppable psychic powers, this film felt like it came from another planet, and for some countries, it was far too much. Russia banned Akira outright, claiming its imagery could psychologically harm children. Across Europe, censors slapped heavy restrictions on screenings. Even in America, early releases were chopped down, with certain graphic scenes trimmed before VHS copies hit the shelves. But here's the thing. Those bans only fueled the fire. Bootlegs spread like wildfire, and the film developed a cult following that turned it into one of the most influential sci-fi works ever made. Its fingerprints can be seen in everything from The Matrix to Stranger Things. The power of Akira wasn't just in its visuals, it was in its themes. Government corruption, the abuse of science, youth rebellion, it was all there, wrapped in a cyberpunk fever dream. Censors thought they could silence it, but they accidentally made it legendary. Today, Akira is hailed as a masterpiece, yet its history of bans proves that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones someone tried to hide from you. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Now here's a movie that tested the very limits of what people could stomach. While technically straddling horror and sci-fi with its Lost Expedition framing, Cannibal Holocaust became one of the most infamous banned films in history. It didn't just cross a line, it bulldozed it. Shot in a pseudo-documentary style, the film claimed to show real footage of explorers encountering a deadly tribe deep in the Amazon. What rattled audiences was how authentic it looked. Authorities in Italy thought it was real and arrested the director, Ruggero Deodato, charging him with murder until he proved his actors were alive. More than 50 countries banned it, from Australia to the UK, with some still restricting screenings to this day. In the US, it was chopped to pieces before being allowed in certain theaters. The bans were partly due to its grotesque imagery, but also the questions it raised about exploitation, voyeurism, and how far cinema could go. Was it entertainment or was it something darker? That's exactly what made governments nervous. Despite the censorship, Cannibal Holocaust became a whispered legend. Every restriction only drove people to hunt it down, often through bootlegs. Love it or hate it, it forced audiences to reckon with how real a movie could feel and how far filmmakers might go for shock. Battle Royale 2000. Before the Hunger Games turned dystopian death matches into blockbuster entertainment, there was Battle Royale. Released in Japan in 2000, it told the story of students forced by their own government to fight to the death in a televised survival game. It wasn't just violent, it was provocative, and it instantly became one of the most controversial sci-fi thrillers of its era. In the United States, distributors avoided it, terrified of public backlash over its premise of kids killing kids. In Britain, politicians labeled it dangerous and debated whether it should ever be shown. Even in Japan, where it was made, the movie ignited fierce arguments. Some countries banned it altogether, citing fears that its brutal scenario might encourage real-world copycats. But what made Battle Royale so chilling wasn't only the gore, it was the commentary hiding behind the chaos. This wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about control. The film suggested a government so desperate to suppress rebellion that it turned its own youth into weapons, forcing them to destroy each other to survive. That idea landed like a grenade in societies already grappling with questions of authority, freedom, and obedience. Ironically, censorship only fueled its reputation. Bootleg DVDs circulated across America, whispered about in dorm rooms, and traded at conventions. By the time the Hunger Games came along, Battle Royale had already cemented itself as a cult legend. Today, it's recognized as one of the most influential dystopian films ever made, but at the time, it was considered so dangerous that some governments tried to erase it completely, and in doing so, they accidentally made it immortal. The Hunger Games, 2012. By the time The Hunger Games hit theaters, audiences thought they were ready for dystopian sci-fi. After all, it had a popular book series behind it, and a star in Jennifer Lawrence. But censors in several countries weren't convinced. A film about teenagers fighting to the death on live television was too much for some governments to swallow. Vietnam banned the movie completely, arguing that its violence and themes of rebellion were inappropriate for audiences. In other parts of Asia, including China, strict age restrictions were slapped on screenings. Even in the United States, parents groups complained that PG-13 was far too lenient for what they saw as an extremely dark premise. What really rattled the censors wasn't just the battles, it was the allegory. A world where the ruling elite crushed the lower classes by forcing their children to kill one. Another? That wasn't just sci-fi, it was a sharp, thinly veiled critique of real-world inequality and political control. Some governments saw it as dangerous propaganda, not entertainment. The bans, of course, did nothing to slow its momentum. Instead, they helped make The Hunger Games one of the most talked-about franchises of the decade. People weren't just watching a blockbuster, they were watching a movie that dared to put authority on trial. It turns out the Capitol wasn't just fiction. The real fear was that audiences might start seeing the same tactics in their own world. Mad Max, 1979. The original Mad Max is often remembered as the spark that ignited one of cinema's wildest action franchises. But in 1979, it wasn't celebrated everywhere. It was banned, cut, and feared. This low-budget Australian thriller shocked censors worldwide with its brutal vision of a society on the brink, filled with savage gangs, explosive car chases, and deaths that felt too real for comfort. New Zealand banned the film outright, declaring its relentless violence unacceptable. In Sweden, audiences were only allowed to see it after significant cuts. Even in its home country of Australia, censors argued over whether it had crossed the line. Some European nations reacted even more dramatically, claiming its chaotic energy threatened public decency itself. But the outrage wasn't just about smashed skulls and wrecked cars. The true controversy lay in the story's message. Mad Max dared to suggest that civilization was fragile, that law and order could collapse overnight, and that survival might depend on nothing but speed and violence. For governments already worried about rising crime and civil unrest in the late 1970s, that message hit too close to home. Of course, trying to bury Mad Max only made it stronger. Bootleg VHS tapes spread across continents, whispered about among fans hungry for something raw and dangerous. By the time the Road Warrior roared onto the screen, the franchise was unstoppable. What began as a scrappy Australian experiment became a global phenomenon. Every ban and censorship attempt only poured gasoline on its legend. The world tried to slam the brakes on Mad Max, but instead, it put the pedal to the floor, and cinema has been chasing it ever since. The Matrix, 1999. When The Matrix exploded onto screens in 1999, it didn't just wow audiences with groundbreaking special effects, it terrified governments. The film's concept of a simulated reality controlled by machines struck too close to home for censors in several countries. In Egypt, authorities banned it after religious and political leaders argued that its story promoted dangerous ideas about questioning authority and rejecting reality itself. In Lebanon, it faced similar backlash, accused of spreading unsettling philosophy. Even in the United States, media watchdogs labeled it as potentially corrupting because of its stylish violence. But what truly spooked censors was the underlying question. What if the world you know is a lie? That single idea carried more danger than any bullet-time gunfight. Governments worried it would inspire people to question authority, society, and even the very fabric of their own lives. Of course, those fears only gave The Matrix more power. Audiences embraced it not only as a science fiction action film, but also as a modern myth. Its green code, slow-motion fight scenes, and red pill, blue pill philosophy became part of global culture. Trying to censor The Matrix was like trying to censor the internet itself. Impossible. Instead of being silenced, it became one of the most influential movies of its generation. Metropolis, 1927. Fritz Lang's Metropolis may be German in origin, but it changed the DNA of American sci-fi forever. When it premiered in the US, it didn't escape censorship. In fact, it was chopped into different versions depending on who was showing it. Why? Because the story was too politically charged for comfort. At its core, Metropolis is about class warfare, a futuristic city where the elite live in luxury above ground while workers toil in misery below. American distributors worried audiences would see it as a call for rebellion during a time of growing labor unrest. So, entire sequences were cut, including much of its political commentary. But it wasn't just America. In Nazi Germany, the film was attacked for being too sympathetic to the working class. Ironically, Joseph Goebbels would later praise its spectacle while rejecting its message. The result was a movie that was censored into multiple conflicting forms, losing huge chunks of its story in the process. For decades, viewers only saw fragments of what Lang intended. It wasn't until 2008 that a near-complete version was discovered in Argentina, finally restoring its vision. By then, its influence on films like Blade Runner and The Fifth Element was undeniable. Censorship may have tried to cut its voice, but Metropolis proved louder than ever. Nearly a century later, it still feels more daring than most modern blockbusters. Robocop, 1987. Few sci-fi films blended satire and ultraviolence quite like Robocop. On one level, it was a story about a cop turned cyborg fighting crime in a corrupt Detroit. On another, it was a razor-sharp critique of capitalism, corporate greed, and how easily humans could be turned into machines. That double edge made censors nervous. When it first landed, the Motion Picture Association of America nearly slapped it with an X rating for its extreme violence. Studio executives had to cut down multiple scenes, including a notoriously brutal boardroom death and a sadistic attack that pushed boundaries for 1980s action. Even after the cuts, it was still one of the most violent movies to sneak into theaters with an R rating. Internationally, several countries censored it, removing entire sequences before approving it for release. Critics were divided. Was this clever sci-fi, satire, or just blood-soaked excess? For many censors, the answer didn't matter. They simply wanted it toned down. What those censors didn't realize was that the violence was the point. Director Paul Verhoeven wasn't celebrating it. He was satirizing it. Robocop's over-the-top brutality was meant to reflect a society where human life had become disposable. Ironically, every cut version only dulled the satire while sharpening the legend. Fans hunted down the uncut editions, and Robocop became a cult classic. What some governments tried to suppress ended up becoming one of the defining sci-fi critiques of the late 20th century. Planet of the Apes, 1968. When Planet of the Apes hit theaters, audiences expected costumes, action, and maybe a few jump scares. What they got was one of the most politically loaded endings in science fiction history. Charlton Heston screaming on a desolate beach, discovering the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. It was a gut punch that censors in several countries thought was too dangerous. South Korea initially banned the movie, citing its depiction of nuclear war and political collapse as unacceptable. Other governments complained that the film's critique of religion, militarism, and racism was subversive. Even in the United States, some critics accused it of being too bleak for mainstream audiences. What frightened censors wasn't just the spectacle of apes ruling over humans, it was the subtext. Beneath the prosthetics and action sequences was a film screaming about the dangers of war, the arrogance of power, and humanity's ability to destroy itself. In 1968, with Vietnam raging and nuclear fears looming, that message landed like a bomb. The bans and criticisms only fueled its power. Planet of the Apes became a massive hit, spawned sequels, and permanently embedded itself in pop culture. Censors wanted to tone it down, but the film's bold commentary ensured it would never be forgotten. The Day the Earth Stood Still, Nassau 51. On paper, this film looked like a simple alien encounter story, but The Day the Earth Stood Still turned out to be anything but simple. Klaatu, the mysterious visitor from another world, didn't arrive to conquer, he came to warn. Alongside his towering robot Gort, he delivered a message that rattled censors everywhere. Humanity's obsession with nuclear weapons could destroy not just Earth, but entire civilizations. Released during the height of the Cold War, the timing could not have been more explosive. Some critics immediately accused it of spreading pacifist propaganda. In several regions, military leaders pressured theaters to pull the film, fearing audiences might start questioning the arms race. In Spain, under Franco's dictatorship, it was hacked apart, with cuts made to soften its anti-war themes. The moment that really set alarm bells ringing was Klaatu's climactic speech. Here was a fictional alien telling humankind, in no uncertain terms, to change its ways or face annihilation. It wasn't wrapped up in metaphor or hidden in symbolism. It was blunt, urgent, and terrifying to anyone invested in maintaining the status quo. For many governments, this was not entertainment. It was provocation. Yet attempts to mute its message only made it stronger. Audiences connected with the film's haunting call for peace. And over time, it grew into one of the most respected works of 1950s science fiction. Its mix of suspense, philosophy, and morality turned it from a curiosity into a cultural landmark. Ironically, censorship only amplified the film's reach. What was meant to be silenced became one of the most enduring warnings in cinema history. A story that proved sci-fi could do more than entertain. It could challenge the world itself. THX 1138, 1971. Before George Lucas built a galaxy far, far away, he created something much colder, stranger, and far less forgiving. THX 1138 wasn't space opera, it was nightmare fuel. In this vision of the future, humanity has been stripped of names and individuality, reduced to numbers living underground in sterile white chambers. Emotions are outlawed, personal freedom is erased, and a faceless authority monitors every move. No heroes with lightsabers, no epic battles, just a chilling prophecy of what life could look like under total control. Censors didn't like what they saw. In parts of Europe, scenes were cut for being anti-establishment, with critics accusing it of promoting rebellion against authority. In the United States, the movie was slapped with warnings about its disturbing themes, and some theaters flat out refused to show it. The unsettling part wasn't flashy violence or spectacle, it was how real it all felt. Lucas leaned into silence, long stretches where characters shuffle through white corridors or stare blankly while being monitored. The absence of sound and warmth forced audiences to sit with the suffocating weight of oppression. In 1971, with anti-war protests erupting and government surveillance making headlines, this didn't feel like science fiction. It felt like a warning. At release, the film tanked. Audiences wanted escapism, not a bleak reminder of how fragile freedom really is. But as the years passed, THX 1138 gained a cult following. Its censorship and rejection only made it more legendary. Fans later embraced it as proof that Lucas once dreamed of a darker, more unsettling future before chasing the stars. Today it remains one of the most haunting sci-fi visions ever put on screen, a reminder that sometimes silence can scream louder than any explosion. Soylent Green, 1973. By the early 1970s, audiences had seen their share of dystopias, but Soylent Green went further than most governments were comfortable with. Set in a crowded, starving future, it built toward one of the most notorious endings in sci-fi history. The revelation of what Soylent Green really is left audiences shaken and censors scrambling. In Mexico and across parts of South America, authorities argued the film's themes of overpopulation, corruption, and environmental collapse were destabilizing. In the Middle East, it was banned for portraying a grim future for humanity. Even in the United States, critics debated whether it was simply too bleak for a nation already facing political scandals, protests, and economic uncertainty. What made it so controversial wasn't a monster or an alien invasion. It was the mirror it held up. The film suggested that humanity's true enemy was itself. Unchecked greed, corporate corruption, and environmental destruction. It wasn't escapist entertainment, it was a stark warning. For governments wanting optimism on screen, this was a nightmare they didn't want audiences thinking about. Of course, censorship never killed its legacy. The more it was challenged, the more people wanted to see it. Today, Soylent Green feels chillingly prophetic. Pollution, climate change, and corporate control are hotter topics than ever, making its warning even sharper with age. Attempts to bury it only made its message immortal. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. On its surface, Invasion of the Body Snatchers looked like a straightforward alien thriller, townsfolk quietly replaced by emotionless duplicates. But beneath that story was one of the most politically loaded allegories of the Cold War, and that's exactly why it clashed with censors. In Eastern Europe, it was banned outright as Western propaganda, an attack on conformity under communist regimes. In the United States, it sparked heated debates. Was it condemning communism, or was it actually targeting American paranoia during McCarthy's witch hunts? Its ambiguity was its strength, but that same flexibility made censors furious. No one could fully control its message. That double meaning was the film's genius. Depending on who you were, the pods could represent communist infiltrators, or a society crushed by fear and suspicion. Either way, it was terrifying. Governments hated the uncertainty because it meant people might start applying the metaphor to their own lives. Despite restrictions, the film thrived. Word of mouth spread, and it grew into one of the most iconic sci-fi thrillers of its era. Multiple remakes followed, each keeping the core metaphor alive. The real horror wasn't aliens, it was the idea that the systems around you could strip away individuality until everyone looked the same. In trying to silence it, censors only confirmed its message. Sometimes the most frightening monsters aren't from another planet, they're already here. Science fiction has always been dangerous. It asks questions that leaders don't want asked. It imagines futures too close for comfort, and it dares to turn entertainment into a weapon. From giant apes to simulated realities, these 15 films weren't just censored for their images, they were censored for their ideas. And that's exactly why they endure. So, which of these banned or censored sci-fi movies shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe for more cinematic deep dives, and share this with anyone who loves stories that rattle cages. After all, what's more rebellious than a movie someone once tried to hide from you?